Adams, but it's not the oldest church in Adams. So I explain that because the Baptists were founded 13 years or 14 years before this church was founded, and this church was founded in 1840, while the Baptists in 1826. But this is the oldest operating church because the church was built in 1868, 3 years after the Civil War, while the Baptist church was built, what the present Baptist church to use was built in 1896 or something like that. This church was replaced the church that used to be on Park Street on the other side where Crafter's Cottage is. And they sold that church to the Roman Catholics, who moved it up the street and is presently stationed behind the furniture store. So next time you go into Simmons Furniture Store and go up into the stairs, you're going into the old First Congregational Church. When the Irish Catholic bought it, they named it St. Charles Borromeo, and they used it until 1897 when they built St. Thomas Aquinas, and then they moved from there, and that's when, of course, they sold it to Simmons, and Simmons has been there ever since. This is the last of the churches in Adams to be built of wood. Now, I don't think it was because of they had no other material, because there certainly were mills and schools being built out of brick at that time, and there was also, I'm sure, native stone buildings. But I think they wanted the look of a traditional New England church. I mean, the Congregational, after all, the predecessors or the ancestors or the descendants of the Puritans. I think I get the word right. They used to have a large steeple, and if you looked at the pictures, the steeple was maybe 2 or 3 times the size it is now, but a windstorm in the early 1900s blew it over, and you see it took part of the parsonage, part of the parish house with it. Famous people who have spoken here. I think this is the only church that has some very famous people who spoke here. Well, number one, of course, was the President of the United States, William McKinley. And secondly was Booker T. Washington from the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama spoke here, as well as the Tuskegee Institute chorus performed here sometime in the 1920s, I believe. As you noticed, we've tried to determine how wide the span is without any pillars. I think every other church you're going to be going into today will have pillars somewhere down in the middle of the church, but this one does not. I'm not sure how they engineered this or what the architect was, but this is probably the largest distance they could have gone without having to put some kind of added support in the ceiling. If you notice also from that picture that there were 2 large, I believe must have been gas-fired chandeliers that hung from here. And of course, I think there was also a very large furnace that still exists in the cellar, an opening that used to heat the church from the opening underneath that table up front. Do you want to continue now, or do you want to?
Sure thing. I'm Jenny Duval, and I'm also from the Adams Historical Society. Eugene was talking about some of the things in the building that make it like some of the earlier Congregational churches that you see, like say Old First in Bennington from the 18th century. And there are some things here that are very much like that. This gallery in the back is a seating gallery, and there used to be galleries on 3 sides of the church for seating. And that's very much like Old First in Bennington, if you've seen that church there. But they removed the side galleries at some point. But this is not a choir loft, as like you'll see in some of the other churches later when you go tonight, but it's a seating gallery. The choir will be seated up there near the organ and always have that. But there are things about this church that make it very much a part of the 1860s when it was built, the Victorian period. If you look at some of the older pictures, you can see that it's not white clapboard in the oldest pictures, but probably a gray or a tan or a light brown color, kind of matching the buildings next door. So the Victorians would have liked earth tones, and this church early on was of an earth tone color and not white. Other things that you might notice that make it of the 1860s period are some of the Italianate features on the outside. The brackets along the roof line of the building are a decorative period from the Italianate, which was very popular around the time of the Civil War. The other thing of note in this building that would make it more intricate than some other older Congregational churches might be are the stained glass windows. If you look at the one right here over the gallery, this one was a memorial to the dead of World War I. And you see the angel there holding the symbols of war and peace, the sword in one hand and the olive branch in the other. These first 2 pairs of stained glass windows are probably original to the church. But the last three pairs down here were all added later. If you want to take a walk down and we can look at them. This first pair are very new. They were installed in 1996 by Cummings Studios for Adams. And they're in memory of Lillian Liebig, a longtime member of the congregation. They were donated by her husband, Max Liebig. Mrs. Liebig was the medical records department head at the W.B. Plunkett Memorial Hospital for 23 years, from 1940 to 1963, and then for 25 years after that at the North Adams Regional Hospital. And they have, their motifs are, those are the two most important holidays in the Christian calendar. South, we see holly and berries for Christmas, and north, we lilies for Easter. The next pair of windows were donated in memory of two very prominent men in the congregation around the late 1800s and the turn of the century. As you can see from the windows, they have the same color tones. They also have the same motifs at the bottom, those scrolls and circles that they probably were installed at about the same time. This one is in memory of John E. Mole. And the Moles were a very prominent family in Adams at the late 1800s. John Mole had a varied working career. He was a coal salesman at one point. He was born in Adams in 1838. And he was a coal salesman at one point, the first person to sell hard coal in Adams, presumably as opposed to wood or soft coal. And after that, he was the postmaster for 25 years. First appointed by Abraham Lincoln. And then for the final part of his career, he was a messenger at the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., presumably appointed again by the Republicans who were who favored some people in Adams. And he retired from that job in 1911 and came back to Adams and died 3 years later in 1914. And this window is in memory of him. Other prominent members of his family were A.B. Mole, who was the treasurer of the L.L. Brown Paper Company in the late 1800s, and his other brother, F.E. Mole, who had a drugstore in Adams, the site of where the Bank North is today. It was the old Greylock Hotel at that time. And F.E. Mole, the druggist, was also the commander of the local GAR chapter, the Grand Army of the Republic, the Civil War Veterans Organization, and for many years. And so this is John E. Mole's window. This window over here is in memory of Edward Wellcome Streeter, who was born in North Adams in 1846. And he also became employed in the L.L. Brown Paper Company and eventually became the assistant superintendent of operations. But in the 1900s, he owned a shoe store along with another gentleman from North Adams, a very ambitious young man called James Wall. And Mr. Wall and Mr. Streeter and another man, Mr. Doyle, founded a shoe manufacturing concern, Wall Streeter and Doyle, which eventually became to be better known as Wall Streeter, which operated in North Adams until the 1970s and made fine quality shoes. And so he died in 1919, and his wife donated this window for him in 1925. The last two windows are in memory of two of the most famous industrialists in Adams. The one on the left, the children coming to Jesus, is in memory of William C. Plunkett, the general, the original founder of the church that Eugene mentioned, one of the founding members of the church, and who began the Plunkett textile dynasty in Adams. And Mr. Plunkett was a deacon for 21 years in the church, and also the superintendent of the Sunday school for 27 years, something of which he was very proud. And when President McKinley came to town in 1997, McKinley attended church services here on Sunday morning. He went to the Methodist church in the evening, but he attended church here on Sunday morning service and was also introduced to the infant class of the Sunday school, because Mr. Plunkett had a great fondness for the children and was very proud of his Sunday school, and so the infant class were all introduced to the president. And so his memorial window has the children in it, which is very appropriate. The last memorial window is for William B. Plunkett, William C. Plunkett's son, who expanded the cotton empire in Adams in the 1890s. And William B. Plunkett was, along with his brother Charles T., were responsible for the building of, or in great part responsible for financing the building of the community's, the parish hall next door in 1894, and the parsonage church in 1897 is its pipe organ here. This organ was installed in 1883. It's the only bellows pipe organ in Adams this time. It was refurbished in 1978, a wonderful decision by the congregation to put that money into doing that kind of thing instead of replacing it. It was built in 1883 by William Johnson of Westfield, Massachusetts, and he was a prominent builder of organs who was recognized in other places in the state and has organs in other cities in Massachusetts. The case for the organ is older than the organ. The church first purchased an organ in 1854 when it was located across the street on Park Street. And even at that time, when it was a second-hand organ that they believed had been built around 1835. So it's possible that the outside case of this organ is as old as 1835 and was brought over from across the street in 1868 when this church was built. The organist, Joan Manister, can probably tell you more about it, but we opened the door up there so that you take a look in at the machinery behind. There are large bellows that create the sound, and now there's a motor that runs those bellows, but when it was originally made, there would have been a person back there who would have been operating the bellows. And so that Joan was showing me that there's a little button on the organ which would send a signal back to the person at the bellows about the time that they wanted them to start pumping air into the organ, or pumping the air into it. And then this is a tracker action organ, and you'll note the wooden pedals and the keyboards and the stops on the organ all connect to mechanical pieces back there. And if you poke with your head through the door, you can see a wonderful piece of machinery, and so that we hope that you will.
My name is Levi Lawrence Brown, and I am perhaps the best known parishioner of St. Mark's Church here in Adams, Massachusetts. I was born in Adams in 1826, and I lived here pretty much my entire life. And I made my money in three industries: paper, plastics, and textiles. And I'll mention my textiles connection with Renfrew Manufacturing Company in a moment, but I'll just give you a brief discursus about my other two ventures, the L.L. Brown Paper Company. I was a very modest man. Its claim to fame is it printed the largest book in the world, the 1936 Great Lakes Exposition in Cleveland, Ohio. The book was 3 feet by 5 feet by 7 feet and weighed 2.5 tons. And it was supposed to go to Case Western Reserve University after the exposition, but mysteriously disappeared. So if any of you good folks find a 2.5-ton book lying around in your attic, please send it to Case Western. Another major company I was involved in was the Xylenite Company, which gave its name to the Xylenite section of Adams, up where Curtis Fine Papers is now. And it produced an early form of artificial ivory that could be used for everything from shirt collars to billiard balls to combs to fishing rods. The last company I mentioned was Renfrew Manufacturing, and that gave its name to the gingham grounds of Adams. Now, in 1878 was a very important year for Adams. It was the year that Adams split off from what is now North Adams, and that was the year that I gave money to establish St. Mark's Church, the bulk of it. The vestry raised the rest. And now, prior to that time, St. Mark's had been around in a corporate existence since sometime in the 1860s. It was itself an offshoot of what is St. John's Church up in North Adams. But it wasn't until 1878 that the parish actually got the ball rolling on building this structure you see here. And by 1881, the parish had raised the rest of the money, and they built this church between 1881 and 1883. They hired the architect W.C. Brocklesby of Hartford, Connecticut, and Mr. Brocklesby also designed the Old Town Hall, which is now where the Registry of Deeds and the District Court is, as well as the old North Adams Regional Hospital building, which was raised in 1955. So the building was built between 1881 and 1883, and at the same time, Renfrew Manufacturing Company, of which I was a co-owner, built the mill building across the river there, known as the Jacquard Mill. And it employed a lot of German immigrants. And during the 1880s, both St. Mark's here and the First Congregational Church were heavily courting the German immigrants as parishioners. And the first pastor, or rector, Henry Smythe, was so intent on doing this that he actually learned German and started a tradition of bilingual pastors at St. Mark's that lasted right into the 1930s. So interestingly, Adams, despite being a small town, at one point in the 1920s, you could hear 5 different languages from its pulpits. There was English, of course, at, for instance, the Congregational Church of St. Thomas. There was French at Notre Dame. There was German right here at St. Mark's. There was Italian at the short-lived St. Rita's Chapel, which is more or less where Specialty Minerals is now. And of course, there was Polish at St. Stanislaus Church. And I should mention that besides the tour here this evening, there's also a tour of the First Congregational Church and St. Stanislaus Church that you might want to see. In any event, I should point out that this elm tree here is one of the last in the town of Adams. The town used to be lousy with them, but in the 1960s, the last few, but for this one, died off due to Dutch elm disease. And I should also mention my own house used to be right across the street. And in fact, when I donated the money for this church, I also donated the land that it sits on. And I'm about to turn over the program to Keith Shaw, our resident art historian. Before I do so, I'd like you to keep an eye out for pews 29, 31, and 62 in there. Those were my family's pews. So you can actually sit where a famous family used to be. And now I will turn over the program.
Prominent Gothic features that's readily visible from the front here. One is the type of arch. Normally, or before the Gothic period, you would have rounded arches, but you notice that these are actually pointed. It was a more symbolically spiritual language. It suggested praying hands, drawing attention towards heaven. Another strongly Gothic feature, very beautiful, is the round window immediately above the arches. This explosion of color, it'll be more visible once you walk inside, reminded people of a blooming flower, of a rose, and these are called the Gothic rose windows. The architect took full advantage of his material. It's all in stone. In fact, it's the only church here in Adams that's entirely built on stone. Usually the common material was brick, and we have one wooden structure, the first Congregational. But this is entirely stone. And look how the architect has used the stone material, the natural coloration and texture as pure decoration. There's three predominant colors in the building. You have the bluish gray base stone forming the walls. You have the more tan sandstone to pick out some of the structural details. And then for pure decoration, he added this red color here and there. Originally, we actually had red terracotta clay ornaments that also perched on top of the building to add even more color and texture to it. Now, before we go inside, and that's where I'm mostly interested, I want to take a detour and look underneath the bell tower here. Up there originally held the bells. Now I believe it's all digital, right? But if you go underneath there, you know, and when you get a chance, you can stroll by the church, whether it's closed or open. And if you look up here on the ceiling there, you can see the small holes. This is where the ropes hung down, where you could come in and ring the bells. Now, how did they keep the kids from doing that? If you look here, you have the hinges and heavy bars. You know, originally you had the doors on either side of the entry of the bell tower to keep unauthorized ringing out. You open this up at scheduled times. Now let's stroll inside, okay? Not a lot of artwork depicting human figures. Instead, the architect and artist relied on figural work, decorative work, and symbolism. And I'll address that in a moment. One of the most striking features, though, is above our head. Look at this gorgeous ceiling. You know, about 700 years ago, there was an Italian friar living outside of Venice. And he had a problem, how to roof this vast central expanse of a church. And he came up with a wonderfully novel idea. He said, look, you guys are used to building ships. Why don't you build a giant hull of a ship upside down and use that as a roof? Well, 600 years later, when this was constructed, that same technique was in practice. And it makes sense when you think of all of our shipbuilders here in New England. And look at it. It does have the beautiful boarding of the side of the ship. You'll see this even more pronouncedly as we walk into this little alcove over here. Before we get there, though, I want to look at the other striking feature inside of the church, and that's the stained glass. You know, and here's the rose window I mentioned before. Boy, it looks so different from the interior looking out. Stained glass also decorates the side aisle windows as well. Above the central portion of each of the windows, you have little rondelles, little circular glasses. This is a good example of how the artists were thinking in symbolism. You know, there's no religious narratives. You know, there's no biblical stories here. We just have the Jewish Star of David over here, and on the opposite side of the wall we have a crown. Now, if you think about it, this is the crown of Christ. And the Jewish star refers to the Old Testament era, and the crown of Christ refers to the New Testament era. This is an old system born in the Middle Ages of how Christians look at world history. It nicely summarized God's plan, the two halves of the Bible. And they're nicely linked up here by referring to Christ's genealogy that goes back to the house of David. You know, it links the whole system up very neatly, which is what Christian theologians were interested in doing. If we walk a little further down, we see two more and the rondelles. On the right here, you have a chalice. This is a little more simple. And over here, you have some wheat. What does that symbolize? Right now? The chalice symbolizes the Eucharistic wine. And the wheat over here, the Eucharistic bread. So once again, we have a reference to the communion and the whole idea of Christ's sacrifice, which is a central motif in the nectar program of this church. Another thing I want to point out over here is the white dove. Now, yes, it's clearly referred to also the Holy Spirit, but I think it's more generically a reference to peace, but specifically Christian peace. Because if you look in his mouth, his bill, you'll see an olive branch. Now, the olive branch motif is picked up elsewhere in the church. Can you find it? Show you. All around the interior of the church, you have these beautiful terracotta brick molds, and each one represents an olive branch with olives on it. It encircles the entire church. And this too symbolizes Christian peace. So when you're inside of the church, you're literally within a circle of peace. Isn't that a beautiful thought? Let's go on to the opposite side of the church. I want to look more closely at the stained glass windows. You know, stained glass painting, again, is a medieval technique, so it's an appropriate decoration for this church. Again, it recalls all these medieval architectural styles. But you should come closer, to these windows. And when you look at it, you can see how stained glass was done. You take a pane of colored glass, and then you lock each cell of color within this apparatus of lead tracing. I mean, right there, that's the lead, locking in the individual patterns of glass. And then the artist comes in and manually paints all the decoration, picks out all the details on the glass. And if you look at this grid system right here, you can see how labor-intensive this undertaking was. Now, we happen to know the name of the glass decorator of this church. We know it because he's famous. His name is Donald McDonald from Boston. I'll refer to him a little later. Before we go forward, let's go back here and look at this little space. Originally, this was the baptistry. If you can look up here in the ceiling, and does that look like a boat or a block? So you can see what I was talking about before. Now, the baptismal font was originally located right here. It's been transported to the front of the church because there was an issue of safety. Could this small space support large crowds? Originally, though, it stood here, and back here you have more stained glass. Appropriately, what's the motif? You have angels presiding over the baptism of the child. And again, a very touching sentiment. Now, this glasswork is noteworthy in how it differs from the side aisles glass. The side aisle is basically flat, but if you look over here, you have little embossed areas to make this glass even more special. Again, the emphasis on color and texture, and it's really a bygone art. What a lovely look if you get closer. But now let's go towards the front of the church. The pews are divided up. Some run all the way across, but others, they alternate, are divided in halves. That's because originally the patrons of the church actually had to rent pew space. So this particular pew, and look how they're numbered, see, up and down. This would be the pew. What was your number, Levi? Where is it? Where's Mr. Brown? Oh, yeah, well, whatever the number was. You would rent out an entire space if you have a large family, or a shorter space if you have a smaller family, and that way you showed your support and were able to endow the church through your monies. Let's go forward. On the right over here, we have an had an important event in the church and you needed to seat other people, they could be accommodated beyond that screen. Over here on your left is the baptismal font that I mentioned earlier. Come forward. Now, it's a little misleading up here because in 1941, the apse of the church, and that's what this area is called up here, the apse at the end of the church, was renovated. So we don't have the original look of the 1881 design. Everything from the wainscoting down, I believe, is new, including the altar and the altarpiece. An altarpiece is a work of art that stands on the altar or stands behind the altar. And I find this particular paint or this particular work interesting. It's a wood carving. It's by an American artist, and it represents 5 figures. Does anybody know who they are? Any guesses? You haven't been studying. Very good. There's right. Yeah, and the 4 evangelists straddle him. Now, if we were in Europe, we could just look at their faces and instantly pick out which evangelist was which, because in Europe, they had a set facial type. But this American artist was disconnected with that tradition. There's only one face that's instantly identifiable. Do you know who that is? It's like Christ. You know? It's a clean-shaven guy. Who would he be? Yeah, John the Evangelist. He's always the youngest, the most sensitive of Christ's apostles. The other 3 is up to for grabs, but the artist here has given us a hint. Beneath each figure, he has given their initial. It reads M, J, and L. Of course, the L is Luke, but the M, again, is anybody's guess. It's either Matthew or Mark. But which one's which? The one standing immediately to Christ, to the right of Christ, would be Mark. And the reason why is it's his church. This is St. Mark's, so he would receive the place of honor to the immediate right of Christ. Another feature that's a little different from European art is the fact that these evangelists are holding scrolls and books. Now, if we were in Europe, the artist would have given all the evangelists books, because books represented the New Testament era. It was a newer form of writing. Only Old Testament prophets in European art are given scrolls, because it's an earlier time. But the artist here did not understand that, and he alternated scrolls and books. He also alternated the color. Do you see how carefully he has done that? It's blue, red, blue, red. It's in the background, it's also in the clothing. Here, this is for symbolic purposes. The red stands for blood, the blood of Christ. The blue stands for heaven, that is the divinity of Christ. And together, they symbolize the divine sacrifice of Christ, which again is very appropriate because you have Christ the Redeemer reaching out and blessing the altar that commemorates his divine sacrifice. Now, above the windows, back to Donald McDonald. The reason why he's a well-known glass decorator is because in 1881, the year that the church was founded, Tiffany in New York patented a new process of stained glass making. It's called opalescent glass. You see, this glassware is transparent. You can actually see through it if you get up close. But if you look at this here, it has a more milky, pearl-like density to it. It's not as transparent. The result is that it's a more gem-like, rich effect. And this is a spectacular example of opalescent glass. It's also one of the first examples of the technique in America, because McDonald of Boston was one of the very first practitioners of the technique, just like Tiffany